Hey, good morning, all. It's July 12th, 2022, at about 11 a.m. my time, and yet another revelation of how incredible the world is, and quite frankly, how beyond incredible it is, and finite, and quite frankly, how tiny we are. Did you see the satellite reflections of this new satellite that NASA revealed last night? I posted a picture on Facebook that I got from NASA that showed this incredible array of galaxies and huge celestial bodies that was described that when you put your hand out, it would be the equivalent of the space. I can't have my hand here. Of that, it was, I think, something, a grain of sand at the end of your arm. That picture was that size of the frame of the universe, and it had literally infinite amount of galaxies with infinite amount of stars. The size of the universe is unfreaking believable, and no matter whatever happens in our lives, you can't lose sight of the fact that, as huge as things are to us, in the grand scheme of things, maybe they're not so big. In fact, I think it's impossible to describe how small we are. But in either case, big things are going on in the universe, as well as reflections every day and revelations of exactly how things work. I mean, look, just size it up today. What? We're going to have freaking Steve Bannon investigated by the January 6th committee hearings, and helmed by none other than the daughter of Dick Cheney. I'll bring that full circle. Liz Cheney has acted very responsibly and, quite frankly, I'd say heroically, in light of all of the things that come with it, with the Republican Party, the modern Republican Party, given Trump. But Bannon's going to be investigated and asked questions, from what I understand, based on his interactions with right-wing militia groups and that sort of thing, Proud Boys and the rest of them. And ultimately, if they don't ask questions about the Mercers and the Kochs and Adelson and all of the dark money sources from the billionaires that were actually puppeteering this whole thing and making it all possible, not to mention the whatever the role of Blackwater was, like Eric Prince and that incredible array of gun for hire mercenaries that were showing up on the streets of Black Lives Matter in Portland, and whatever their involvement was with the insurrection, which I think was everything. I think those guys were actually the ones coordinating it all. But the January 6th committee hearings are focusing on all the stupidity that Trump was involved with. And Trump is just that stupid, to all you Trump supporters, which makes you what? And all, I mean, I don't want to pick a fight with you necessarily, but it's absurd that anyone would put trust in that fool. Because to me, the way I'm looking at it is he's a setup. He acted exactly as probably anybody in intelligence would have predicted, and he's a great fall guy, even though he's guilty up to his eyeballs. But as long as everybody's focusing on him in context of the 72 million people that voted for him, when he lied about, electioneering fraud and so on and so forth, when he himself was engaged in unbelievable degrees of fraud, not to mention trying to create an insurrection, which, he's a traitor. I mean, by the definition, but I'm only laughing because, when we compare to this to other, insane things that have happened in the United States and scandals and so forth, I mean, really, the insurrection is huge, but in comparison to some of these other things that I'm going to bring up and what I continue to launch truth bombs into, it's as small as that portion of the galaxy that was refracted in those new telescope imagery. I mean, it's literally that's the scale of what we're talking about. And the first thing I want to kind of chime in on, because I started to go down this direction, is because let's consider Liz Cheney in context to her father, of course, Dick Cheney. In all things, his Darth Vader role as the shadow president during the Bush administration, and all things 9/11. Look, I've told you before, and I know what I'm talking about along these lines. It's pretty evident, given the evidence that's out there, and this is public domain. This isn't something that I'm postulating, that I'm using hyperbole to try to put together. It was an intended intelligence failure. Cheney was at the apex of making sure that the two agencies didn't reveal what they knew, not to mention what NSA knew about the terrorist cells that were in the United States and all of the information that came together. It was crystal clear that they weren't talking to each other because Cheney wouldn't allow it. We know that. Okay, so what happened as a result of that? Well, we had 9/11 and the towers collapsed. A lot of people want to go into inside job and they want to go into each floor was, pegged with dynamite and everything else. And it, looked awfully strange to people that, weren't aware of the fact that that's what those buildings were designed to do in a situation like that. Yeah, although they were never designed to actually take the impact of a 57, they were designed to take the impact of smaller planes. But I think at the time they were McDonnell Douglas. I can't remember the model number, but in the 70s when the architect put that whole thing together, they had considered planes flying into the buildings, and they also, for other reasons, because Manhattan has so many buildings, they designed the Twin Towers to be able to collapse. They actually did exactly what they were supposed to do. Given the fact the heat and the melting and everything else, and I know a lot of truthers will talk about other elements that are interesting. The only thing that ever had me kind of tweaked out, quite frankly, in the 9/11 deal in terms of like a whodunit is Building 7. Yeah, that one's still very peculiar considering what was in Building 7, but I digress. That's not exactly my point, but my point is in context to Joe Biden is going to Saudi Arabia to kiss the ring of MBS, and everybody in media is going to talk about Khashoggi and the Washington Post guy, again, kind of a microcosm of the actual big picture that I'm revealing to you. Because as bad as the Khashoggi incident was compared to 9/11 and everything that came after, it's a freaking needle in a haystack, quite frankly. And I don't want to dismiss the value of Khashoggi, but I also don't want people out there to not be aware of the fact that Khashoggi's uncle was the biggest arms dealer in the world. And he worked exclusively with the United States and was heavily involved with what they called Contragate at the time. And he also had money involved with all sorts of different real estate developments around the country. One was known as Triad, which involved Donald freaking Trump, okay? Saudi money has been in the United States real estate market since the 70s, okay? And particularly down in Texas and other developments all over the country. There was a big one in Salt Lake City and, but yeah, the hierarchy of this hive and everything else that comes from it is just twisted and crazy. And yet, the media just gets into this sort of thing about, okay, we're going to talk about one small dimension of it as opposed to the constellation of how the whole thing works, right? And so again, just to repeat before I jump off into the next segue here, you've got Steve Bannon, who I think is the brains of the entire operation, who was definitely a node, not just to the public, through his platform, his media platform, but ultimately, of course, to the big funding sources, which were the Mercers. And the Mercers were involved with Cambridge Analytica, and that's how they manipulated the masses. And I don't know if they were first to the table, with whatever the KGB version of, their tech sector within the KGB is. But, certainly Cambridge Analytica were extremely sophisticated at manipulating how information gets to us, and then ultimately how it refracts to create, reactions. I mean, it's all psychology, and the Mercers are genius at this whole thing and diabolical as hell. You put them in context of the Koch brothers, and again, here's another intersection, right? So the Koch brothers' father, Fred Koch, built the Soviet Union's oil infrastructure, of which right now Putin, of course, is fighting in Ukraine, again, as kind of an extension of the oil petro state that Russia has become. They're a one-dimensional economy outside of its, rare earth metals and some other things, natural resources across the board that Europe depends on, and now Asia in a big way. But the pipelines, natural gas, everything, the whole purpose of this war in Ukraine is to basically geopolitical leverage through these pipelines, because Western Europe is dependent on, Russian fossil fuels primarily. And from what I understand, Germany is in a crisis moment based on Putin choking off natural gas to Germany's economy. If Germany goes sideways, there's a good chance all of Europe's going to go sideways. And of course, they go sideways because we're in a global community, globalized economy. Then, of course, there's going to be ramifications for the United States. And we're already feeling it, of course. But that takes us back to this whole notion of fossil fuel to begin with. We could have literally pivoted out of fossil fuel energy and reconstituted our entire paradigm, quite frankly, before 9/11. We've had the technology that long, and we had the intelligence long before 9/11. The technology hasn't exploded in ways in the last 20 years that we didn't have some degree of sophistication at that time. In fact, if you really want to look at Dick Cheney and the whole, let's call him Darth Vader shadow presidency, two things that came out of 9/11 that didn't exist with their surveillance state, of course, that ultimately led to the rise of the tech companies in monumental ways, and a fusion with the government, which a lot of the MAGAs call deep state, and they're not wrong. But then the other side of that is the fossil fuel infrastructure that we continue to be dependent upon, that creates these fluctuations and these leverages through strongmen, and and of course, not to mention the emissions that are choking the world. I mean, literally, guys, there's solutions to every single problem we have, but it seems like the power that's in control, they want to maintain that control and power to the detriment of everybody. And how far are they willing to go? Well, consider 9/11 and 2008 as your two examples. And ultimately, my come from in this whole thing is 2008. And it's not just because people got buried, which was horrible, myself included, lives turned upside down, inside out, and everything else. A lot of the times, my philosophy has always been, you get into a contract where you're lucky enough to get loans based on your ability to pay back loans, which is your own responsibility, and you've risen in a level of your adulthood to be able to be dependable, not just for your family, but on credit and everything else. I mean, that's really how our society functions. And so, I was always really hamstrung at the early phases of me delving into what created the 2008 great financial crisis based on, if you get caught up and you can't pay, well, of course foreclosure is going to happen, right? But it wasn't, as I started to dig into it, I started to understand that, okay, and I don't want to get into my whole story because my whole story is long and it's layered and everything else, but I was on the right side of it the whole time because I knew it didn't make sense. I knew that there was shit going on behind the scenes that it appeared to me like a whole magnitude of grift and lies, which it was. But the biggest point of all that I continue to lay on you, and I look back at some videos that I created when we first started back in February of this year, I've been telling you the entire time that the Federal Reserve created this emergency stimulus through Federal Reserve Act 1330, which is under exigent circumstances, where they pumped $29 trillion into the financial system that had blown up the world that I later learned was built on control fraud. It was all set up to basically set vulnerable people up who weren't sophisticated enough to understand that they were actually signing contracts that were going to blow them up. But see, at that time period, everybody could refinance. A rolling loan knows no loss. So they didn't really care. They were basically, and this is what our society has done writ large, especially corporations. They've replaced revenue and stability with credit and the flow of credit, liquidity. And that whole thing stems from this whole monetary policy stymied by the Fed. And it never elevated to this level in the history of the United States. Now, there were elements that were similar, such as the Resolution Trust after the S&L crisis. And again, after the Great Depression, we did offer people modifications, and then we created Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to be able to get the loans off the books to create liquidity for the banks and so forth. But we stabilized the economy because we also created revenue after the Great Depression, because of course we had World War II and then we had an industrial economy, and people invested in bonds and that whole sort of ecosystem that saved the day at that time period. But then it made us last man standing, right? And so we became the global superpower that we are, that ultimately, and I'll bring it full circle, was predicated after 1971 because we got rid of the gold standard on the oil standard, which brings me full circle to Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia and OPEC trading in US dollars has ultimately enabled all of these other things to exist. So at the hierarchy of this whole thing, which I presented in my film Forward 13, Waking Up the American Dream, is the financial fossil fuel juggernaut that basically hijacked our government. And they've done this since really it could go back to like post World War II, but on overdrive in the late 90s, and then everything we've been living out and since has been an extension and a consequence of that power play, and everything is a myth. And what they've done is they've created financial policy through this 0% interest, and then the bond buyback program through the quantitative easing that could buy bonds, so that you have all of these financial institutions and private equity and hedge funds and banks and so on and so forth. They're basically just buying up real estate because they can hyperinflate the value of the asset, like we show in the con, and then they throw it through the assembly line of fraud, and then the government bought it back. So again, I keep telling you, and I'm not going to yell this time, it's not capitalism. It's not free markets. It's corporate fascism undergirded by a criminal syndicate, where we lost at least 3,000 people on 9/11. We've lost millions around the world since the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, all to maintain this sense of power. Then we had 2008 that basically buried at least 50 million people around the world. I think it's closer to over 100 million, maybe 150 million, between people who lost their homes, pensions, and all sorts of collateral damage around the world, okay, that were highly invested in this stuff. And then what we did was we let everybody fail, which led to homelessness and all sorts of divorces and suicides and everything else, that then ultimately became the bailouts that then led to them doubling and tripling down and everything that I've told you since. And we continue to be on this the treadmill of misery, and we have answers for every problem. So ultimately, we have the technology right now to move really almost immediately, while we still have value of the dollar, into reconfiguring the paradigm of energy in the United States. Solar is incredibly reliable. Geothermal and hydro and wind and all of those things, the technology has gone huge. What we have to do now is to reconfigure the paradigm, which we have the technology to do. And if we rebuilt it, it's somewhere between $4 to $6 trillion. At least that's what's been projected, by some of the sources that I pay attention to. And if you had complete energy independence, you wouldn't have to rely on the fluctuations of fossil fuels, nor would you have to fund terrorism, nor would you have to allow a financial juggernaut, military-industrial juggernaut in the United States to basically be the Darth Vader power of the dark force that's hijacked our democracy. I don't know. It's so crystal clear to me. I don't know why everybody doesn't get this. It's just paint by the fucking numbers. It's power operating behind the scenes, just like we learned as a child watching The Wizard of Oz, except they're diabolical. And there's death and there's destruction. And it's not just for all the people that die and get homeless and go to divorces and all of these other things and you can't keep up with inflation. It's even worse than that. It's if that could be any worse. I mean, if you're in that situation, it doesn't get any worse because game over, right? I mean, those of you who have gone through this, I know what it feels like. And then at the end of the road, we continue to pump out these fossil fuel emissions, and we have these cataclysmic fires all over the West. Particularly, we have problems with oceans and corals and everything that we've known about for 30 fucking years. And the question is, why? Can you answer that question? I can. It's because we don't do anything with the information that we have access to. So all it tells me is that 99% of you don't care, quite frankly, especially if you're benefiting from it, that the United States government would allow an industry to lie through deception and predatory tactics to set up millions upon millions of really, let's just call them what they are, ignorant people, not stupid, ignorant. You know what you know. They're not sophisticated in terms of what could potentially take place on a contract. You dangle free money out in front of somebody, they're going to take it just like a rat with cheese. And then ultimately you set them up to be frickin' fracked. But here's the thing. It's not capitalism and it's not free markets. Because at the end of the road, what I continue to tell you is the Federal Reserve, based on the full faith and credit of the United States, that was won because of our sacrifices in World War II, that put us in a position to become the global superpower, to create this 4 decades long march to neoliberalism and financialization that's backstopped by the dollar, that has to rely on the oil standard, honestly. That's the world that we live in. And that's the one that's propped everybody up. And that's what's created this huge gulf in the disparity of wealth, the disparity of knowledge, the disparity of life, the disparity of everything else. And the question that I continue to ask all of you who are navel gazing that are like, oh my God, there's nothing I can do about it. Yeah, there is. You can watch what I put together. You can come together. You can foment, a movement with us, which is the justice movement. You can demand justice, and we can do it peacefully before there's no other choice. It's a sinking ship. It's a Titanic. Are we all going to fight over the small lifeboats and kill each other while we're trying to get on? Or are we going to take over the ship before it hits the iceberg? Metaphor doesn't work exactly because we hit the iceberg long ago. There's still a chance to do this peacefully, in my opinion, but I think that time is waning. The bad guys continue to win. Why do you want them to win? Can we let truth and justice become more powerful than a cauldron of lies? Can we do that? Can we believe in liberty and justice for all and do what we've, the freedoms that have been bestowed upon us by previous generations that sacrificed their lives to give us the opportunity to do what we have to do peacefully? We can do it peacefully. We don't have to invade the Congress resurrection with a bunch of crazy guys that just got out of jail that have swastikas on their shoulder or wave Confederate flags. No, we don't have to do that. We could get tens of millions of people that are on the downside of this system to Washington, D.C. and chant the con at the Federal Reserve, the DOJ, and get on the Washington Mall and actually make our voices known and do it while we still have time. Because time is running out. Trust me.